We're taking oral evidence as part of our inquiry into the ministerial system of government on the Isle of Man. And for the benefit of Hansard and anyone listening, please could you introduce yourself?
Yes, good afternoon. Alfred Cannan, Chief Minister.
Is there any opening statement that you'd like to make? Have you prepared anything?
Well, I'd just like to say thank you for the opportunity to appear in front of the committee. I think it is the correct thing to be doing, absolutely, to be looking at the ministerial system. I think it is one part of the whole cog of the democratic system that we are in. As the social attitude survey has shown on the Isle of Man, as a recent Ipsos poll has shown in the UK and throughout Europe, there is a level of dissatisfaction with democracy at the moment. That's absolutely right. I think that we should have an eye on improving outcomes, and I think the role of the Council of Ministers within that, in terms of delivering improvements to the quality of life and outcomes for our residents, is absolutely vital.
Now, we've heard oral evidence from your predecessors, Sir Miles Walker, Tony Brown, Howard Quayle, also from Chris Robertshaw and Alistair Ramsey thus far. Have you any comment on anything that's been said so far?
I think the only thing is I would say is I'm probably not qualified really to comment on the previous system in terms of the board system and how that was impacting. I came into politics in 2011 and the ministerial system at that stage was very well ensconced. So reflecting back, pre-ministerial system is one that I would only be undertaking from a sort of normal island resident's perspective rather than any formal political expertise.
And there's been an awful lot of conversation over the course of those evidence session around democracy, which is what you've introduced with, and that the ministerial system changes from the board to the ministerial system we now have. That there was very much a wider conversation that was ongoing at the time around Latimer House principles, around government, parliament, the judiciary, how all of these things interact and how well they might interact and improvements to those. Did you have any comment to make perhaps on democracy as it sits now and how it sits and communicates into the government system that you have experienced?
Well, in terms of those separation of powers, I think they're pretty well ensconced procedurally and legislatively in island democracy, and I think they are fair and they are pretty clear in terms of how they are operating, and I don't think there is within this examination there is any particular relevance or concern that I would have in terms of conflict, in terms of the judiciary separation of powers, the executive separation of powers, and the parliamentary. But if anything, it may lead on to some examination of the sort of role of Parliament and the executive. But in terms of that sort of Latimer House sense of clarity and purpose around separation of powers, then I think the island's position is relatively clear, straightforward. And I wouldn't come here with any significant concerns about that.
So we're just going to go straight for it then and have that conversation around ministerial system of government. Mr. Hooper.
So you started in Manx politics in 2011, so you will have seen 3 administrations now. Over that period of time, how do you see the ministerial government having worked, and how has it evolved and changed over the course of those 3 administrations that you've experienced?
So it's definitely been, each administration has had its definite challenges. Obviously, the first administration under Alan Bell, there was a significant change in the island's fortunes, literally, in terms of the VAT renegotiation and the impact that had on government finances, and that interlinked, obviously, with the financial crash itself, presented a huge number of challenges for the government of the day, both in terms of adjusting public spending, but also dealing with the fallout and the social fallout, I think, in terms of the numbers of people unemployed, the shrinkage in the economy, and the adjustments to the way public funds were being spent. So that was the critical issue for that administration. Obviously, under Howard Quayle, we had a more stable first 4 years in terms of trying to correct the position and the outcomes that have been delivered by the previous administration. Not to say that they were all bad, but there were clearly a number of things that, standing afresh politically, that you wanted to try and change. But then, of course, we had the COVID crisis, which presented a whole raft of different challenges, and of course this administration has dealt with its own both fallout from that, but other external influences and internal influences that have created a huge number of challenges. So each actually of the administrations in their own way have had something more challenging to deal with over the last sort of 15 years than arguably what had gone on before. I was actually struck by, this sort of sense that between 86, when the ministerial system first came into play, the growth actually during my father's time and Sir Miles Walker's time, which had been seen in terms of the finance sector, the regulation of the finance sector, the number of businesses that were attracted to the island, and of course that growth in our VAT revenue share, driven very much by that growth in the finance sector. But of course, it strikes me there's almost been two very distinct periods between 86 and sort of 2006, 2007, and the last, nearly 20 years or so, if you like, the second half, if you were looking at it, of the ministerial system, where the island's been dealing, I think, with a different set of challenges driven by the outcomes that we saw in that sort of 2007 to 2009 period.
I think it's a fair comment actually to say each government has had its own particular challenges, but it is fair to say they've all faced something pretty critical that's coalesced around them. We've heard before that actually the ministerial system is quite a good system when it comes to allocating money. So when you're doing positive, good things, it's relatively effective as a system to do that, because you've got individual concentrated kind of responsibility, you've got a collective council of ministers that is good at that. But when it comes to dealing with the responding to some of those critical issues and some of those crises, it's a system that we've heard finds it slightly harder to do that, to make those sort of unpopular or difficult choices. Is that something that you've seen over the course of you're a backbencher, you're a minister, you're now chief minister? Is that something you've seen from all those perspectives, that when it comes to the ministerial system, as a system being able to respond to those crises, those critical issues, do you think it's an effective system for doing that?
I think it's a fair observation that, clearly dealing with any difficult decisions actually politically is tough. I wouldn't just extend that, from the Council of Ministers. I'd extend that, of course, into Tynwald as well. I think there are some flaws within that in terms of reaching the decisions that are necessary in such a way that, one, the reasoning behind reaching that decision is clearly communicable and understandable, and then having the resolution to stand behind that decision as well, often under quite heavy attack then, which is likely to come from your colleagues in Tynwald or possibly from other positions outside. So yes, it can be difficult to reach the tougher decisions without having those watered down or diluted, or indeed not getting through council.
So in terms of the system itself, obviously you've seen that happen as a backbencher when you were probably one of the people criticising government's decisions. You've seen that when you were in a driving seat in the Treasury, and you've now seen it again in the driving seat as Chief Minister. Thinking back on your experiences, you mentioned those flaws in the process and that the difficulty in holding the line. What are the sort of things you would think about changing actually around the system itself that would help government hold the line, that would help government make it easier to communicate those decisions and the information behind it? What is it that you've seen yourself actually, if only we had X, or if only we'd been able to do Y? What is it that actually would have made the ministerial system more robust and more responsive?
So I guess trying to think of it, in the whole rather than on a sort of picking holes just sort of on individual decisions that have or haven't gone through. I guess the Council of Ministers is a sum of the parts effect, will only be as good as the people effectively that are politically represented in Tynwald in many ways, and that goes for not just the presence but within council, but I think the ability of Tynwald to also think carefully about the decisions that are being undertaken and to have effective scrutiny around those decisions as well. So I would say to the committee, I think just to think of council in isolation sometimes might be a mistake, I think, without thinking of the broader context in which it is also operating. Going back to the sort of makeup of council itself, I guess I would probably start at the top. I know you're probably going to ask me about this, but I think it is pertinent to answer your question, Mr. Huber. The role of the Chief Minister within that is clearly quite critical, because effectively it is very much a sort of chair type role. Dispel that myth that exists that under the current system the Chief Minister holds any responsibilities for the decision making per se. I mean, that normally is undertaken in the departments and by the Minister. The Chief Minister plays his role or her role in terms of sort of scrutinising that and supporting or not otherwise the decision. And I think at difficult times, I think potentially having more of a stronger position in that evaluation of the decisions that need to be made would potentially be helpful, I think, towards leading to better outcomes, particularly if the role itself is going to be continued to be put on this sort of pedestal, if you like. And the difference, I think, between the Chief Minister on the Isle of Man and the Prime Minister, for example, in the UK, although actually, interestingly enough, both roles actually have very little direct power. In fact, Boris Johnson in his autobiography said being a mayor of London, he had more, he was in a greater position of effectively responsibility and capable of acting on that responsibility than he did as Prime Minister. But nevertheless, effectively you've got a party system behind you which has backed you into that position. So you do carry a huge amount of soft power, if that is the right description, and perhaps, remember that the Chief Minister has soft power indeed through his or her ability to hire and fire the team, effectively, or the ministers around them. But nevertheless, is effectively that sort of head of government, that representative, often I think there can be a sense of frustration. So certainly I think looking at the position of that role and strengthening it, perhaps by, for example, giving the Chief Minister a power of veto, or allowing the Chief Minister the power of a vote in some capacity to take a proposition forward, even if it didn't have full consensus in amongst his ministers. Either of those two mechanisms, for example, might add some weight to getting perhaps either tougher decisions through or allowing for decisions that were perhaps taking what might be seen to be taking government off in the wrong direction to be nullified. In both cases, obviously, you would need to have an explanation, a mechanism, of course, where the Chief Minister would have to clearly explain himself or herself to Tynwald. But that, for example, might help more with getting potentially harder decisions through.
If I could just jump in with a quick one. You've always said that you believe in a collegiate style of management, and certainly as a backbencher I've seen that, and I think it's a good way of doing things. After 4.5 years in the top job, do you still believe that was the best way to do it? Or do you think that the Chief Minister needs to be a little bit firmer in terms of the policies that he wants to see through in an administration?
So I think that if you're looking at that role at the top, and I do think there is a good reasons, or strong reasons to look at it, particularly when all the surveys you're doing are telling you the public are dissatisfied about how things are happening. Absolutely. I mean, for me, I'd already stated that contrary to your other evidence givers, particularly the former chief ministers, I do think there is merit actually in considering how a chief minister on a public mandate could be successfully elected with the right caveats in place and the right protections in place. That is certainly worthwhile continuing to consider. If you're carrying on the consensus government piece, I guess you have to ask the question less about the individual, but is consensus still absolutely the right way? Is it continuing to deliver results in the environment that we live in? I would argue that it is more complex now in terms of the big issues facing government than without sounding as if you're sort of discrediting former governments in terms of the challenges they face, because they all had challenges in their own right and in their own time. But arguing now the complexity and the size of the issues that we're facing, particularly things around energy, for example, would lead you to say, actually, for right, for wrong, giving the person who has been asked to lead the government more direct responsibility has got its justification in terms of determining outcomes, because arguably a lot of these outcomes still remaining quite confused in terms of directions of travel. They are complex issues, but yes, giving that added weight to it is something that I would absolutely consider supporting at the moment. I do accept, of course, that nobody wants a dictator if you're going to have proper democratic outcomes. But I think I did allude to perhaps two of the mechanisms that you might consider employing if you were going to say, actually, we think we should strengthen the ability in terms of that leadership ability of the Council of Ministers to come up with a direction of travel and to either address the more tricky situations or provide absolute clarity on the way forward. Of course, accepting that all that's going to get challenged and voted on, presumably in some capacity in the Parliament.
So it's interesting. One of the questions that we had down here was to ask about whether the Chief Minister's role wields too much power. And it seems, I'm going to kind of paraphrase your evidence here. What you're saying is the perception of the role of Chief Minister is that he does hold a lot of power and actually should take some of that responsibility. The reality is very different, and actually you don't have a lot of actual legal power as a Chief Minister. You are first amongst equals, almost, rather than I'm not going to use the word dictator, but you know what I mean, rather than someone with more actual legal authority. Your view seems to be that in order to deal with that difference of viewpoint will be to lean into the public viewpoint a bit and say, actually, if the public expect the Chief Minister to have more power, we should give him more power. I think my view would have been the opposite, actually, would be to say, no, this is the reality of the role, and it is more then about reforming the relationship between Council of Ministers themselves and Comyn and Tynwald, because like you said, this isn't just about the Council of Ministers, it's about how Tynwald works. The question I've got for you, I think, is if you're talking about, I don't know, say, for example, giving the Chief Minister a veto power or the public election of a Chief Minister, either one of those has the same effect, you are risking increasing the tension between the Chief Minister and his council, or between the Chief Minister and the rest of Tynwald, because ultimately you've got one person who may be in a minority vetoing what 8 other ministers want to do. Do you not think that putting those kind of provisions in place could create some instability then? I mean, I'd say there's some further instability within the Council of Ministers. And do you not think that having that in place could cause those tensions to boil over and come out in unexpected ways?
Yeah, I think it's a perfectly reasonable judgment to make. I think you would be looking at enhancing the role, recognising, of course, that effectively it does create potentially additional risk, or arguably may create better outcomes as well. I think it's like the power to direct departments. So Council, of course, has that power to direct department. You don't really want to use that, because that sort of says that actually the minister, the individual, is out of sync with their colleagues. In other words, is not listening, is not perhaps buying into the fact that consensus is telling them something else. So I agree. Even if you did give that, if you were a fellow minister and I'd said, well, I'm sorry, no matter what council is saying, I'm vetoing that because I just don't think it's in the public interest for us to carry on with that policy. And then have to go and explain that to Tynwald, clearly, because you want some mechanism. Tynwald are going to be concerned if the Chief Minister's vetoed something. So let's just say that you've gone and explained that. Yes, I mean, as the fellow minister, I guess you run the risk of saying, and your fellow ministers do run a bit of a risk within that. But by the same token, on the flip side, you also run the risk of pursuing a policy that is just not delivering for the for the island, for the people. And actually, arguably, you may find that the more common consensus is to go with the view of the chief minister. So, it is a balance. But I have to go back to that question: does that mean you're going to get a better outcome for the people of the island? Versus are we delivering for the right outcomes at the moment for the people of the island? So I guess you'd have to put those. I wouldn't necessarily be the complete judge of that. I've got my own view, of course, but on all these different policies. But that ultimately surely should be the judge, and whether actually, as a council, there does need to be more sort of effectively central power given, or do you find another way? Because effectively, if you don't do that, you just keep it. You carry on with this system effectively of you've almost got 9 different departments, or effectively you took that into the commercial. 9 different companies. I don't like corporatizing it, if you like, but 9 different sets of individuals, 9 sets of different executives, all making their own decisions, and then trying to, obviously it's your role, Chief Minister, to try and coordinate that and bring it together, so that actually we're not rubbing against each other, but we are trying, to deliver for the whole. But of course, you will recognise that's not an easy system to deal with.
Do you not think that in the situation there, where at the moment you have a collective responsibility situation, and I'm sure we'll get onto this later anyway, where when the government takes a position, that is the position of the government and all the ministers are required to back it. In a situation where the Chief Minister has maybe vetoed his ministers, could the Chief Minister then expect their support on that issue that he's vetoed and publicly gone out and said, I had to veto this decision that was made by 5 of my ministers because it's the wrong thing to do? When that comes to Tynwald, does the Chief Minister then count on the support of those ministers under collective responsibility, even though it's publicly acknowledged that they all disagree with him? And then if that vote then subsequently fails in Tynwald, does that fall on the Chief Minister himself or herself to take full responsibility for that outcome? I'm just a little curious as to how, when you're going out and saying we need to break with collective responsibility, which I've got no issue with in principle actually, it's just when you break that, suddenly a lot of other questions then arise as to, well, what are the consequences of taking a slightly more open approach to doing government and taking a step back from this, the government line is thus.
Yeah, I mean, it does, that potentially does create issues. I've got no, I think it's a fair analysis that you're making that as a risk, absolutely, a risk potentially. So if you're challenging the current sort of status quo of the system, you're either of the view it's working well and actually for all its flaws it does the job, or you take the view actually the system can be enhanced. And I'm sure there's plenty of examples of controversial government policies that have come through, not just in this administration but others, which have clearly caused a lot of consternation. Maybe a 5-4 split in the Council of Ministers, right? So let's just take that 5-4 split. That, and I'm sure even my predecessor, Howard Quayle, would get very concerned, as I do, if you've got a 5-4 split on a subject. That's really not a healthy position to be in. So you might put some parameters around it, for example, around how such a mechanism could and when such a mechanism could be used, and or routes for that to work, play out. But yes, there potentially are consequences. I think a 5-4 is probably, let's say, 8 ministers agree. I mean, would the Chief Minister use that sort of power in those circumstances? I think he or she would then be clearly concerned that they're not got the ability to go to Tynwald and explain themselves and potentially survive a vote, which then might start causing questions about their leadership. So it would be, I mean, I put it into the context of another judgment call, and I'd probably go to that issue of around maybe, powers to direct, etc. Arguably, that is the same type of principle that you've just alluded to, in terms of just had to direct that minister to do something. Is the relationship with them and the Chief Minister, or the relationship with them and the Council where it should be at this particular time, and or what other issues are at stake? Because you then, as you will well know, start questioning things like, is the executive within that department functioning properly? What's caused the issue for it to fall out of line to such a point where somebody's gone, I direct you to do this, depending on the scale of the issue, of course, naturally.
It's interesting to think about how that would interact with the individual election then of individual members, because in the UK, like you rightly alluded to, the Prime Minister can fall back on, they're all in the same party, they're all in the same manifesto. It's quite straightforward to see where the accountability lies. But when you've got a situation where you'll be going back out to the electorate saying, I know that I was Minister for Education, but that wasn't really my policy, I was directed to do that, or the Chief Minister threatened a veto if I didn't do what he told me. All of a sudden, you start to get much greyer as to who was actually responsible for that decision. Because like you say, the Chief Minister, the power would probably be used more often in the breach. It's a soft power. I will veto this if you do it, rather than getting to the stage of needing a veto. So you're giving ministers almost a get-out clause at re-election time. Anything good was their job. Anything bad was ultimately the Chief Minister's responsibility. It seems like you're setting future Chief Ministers up for a fall.
It's not something that I would just suggest. I mean, I do think that if the results of this committee are to think actually there are some improvements that we need to make, actually this central piece is quite critical to that overall performance. I think perhaps if I can just sort of add, this also perhaps reflects in terms of the capabilities of government to deliver things like efficiency programs, for example, where of course you are still relying effectively on the goodwill of chief officers, particularly, to buy into that programme and to go with it, and indeed the ministers as well, because effectively, you've got, as it stands at the moment, they're effectively departments or ministers by name and by law. Effectively, they are effectively the department, but that stream runs right through even the executive. And when you look at the Council of Ministers and its performance, that underneath piece as well, that sort of the direct reports, if you like, in terms of the chief executive officers and chief officers, it's quite fundamental. I mean, we've tried to take steps to give the chief executive officer a bit more power this administration, but I think this piece of this complete tunnel separation is in terms of just figuring that out to get better outcomes, is also sort of a piece of critical thinking, and how whether that sort of central control from an operational perspective, and the role of that chief executive officer would also feed in, I think, partly to the effectiveness of the Council of Ministers. We have tried to seek ways to improve that, but that's also quite critical as well.
We've talked a bit about the role of the Chief Minister. Do you think that there is any scope for the selection process for ministers to be reformed, or do you think the Chief Minister being able to ultimately hire and fire at will, is that appropriate in the context we have, or do you think there's any way that could be improved or changed? For example, in the state of Jersey, the states are the ones that have to ratify appointments to ministerial positions. Anything around that kind of space? that
position was, if my memory serves me correct, was in fact the case, was it not, that Tynwald was electing the ministers and in the end I think decided to absolve that responsibility to the Chief Minister in order to make sure that they were effectively then not conversely hiding behind Tynwald appointees in terms of the overall performance of the Council of Ministers. I don't really have it. I think actually it works relatively well at the moment in terms of overall. I mean, I think if Tynwald were appointing, it would be another complication. I'm not sure what that would. What that would solve in terms of delivering better outcomes. And I think that's the critical piece, isn't it? In terms of trying to figure all this out. Is, you know, how can Council of Ministers, how can we be sure, and I've sat on the backbenches as well, so I'm not speaking just purely from a ministerial perspective, but how can you be in a position whereby actually you've improved outcomes in terms of performance from that, you know, the council who are ultimately delivering on either the commitments made by Tynwald or sort of commitments that have been made by a consensus government that has come into place post election and has to itself deliver that sort of consensus mandate then that is put together post the election. And that's why I guess when you're saying, well, how can, you know, the public be clear that actually the Council of Ministers is now doing what we probably want to happen, and a part of that trust is delegated completely, of course, to the MHKs, who are asked to vote in for the Chief Minister, who then appoints the collective council to deliver that consensus. But of course, I would potentially argue that delegation of vote then for the Chief Minister, who he or she will have already given some outline in their manifesto as to what sort of direction they want the government to go, is actually quite a critical vote, because, you know, then that process, that manifesto effectively either gets, well, it does get ripped up. Some parts of it might go into the island plan, or what we've called the island plan, but into the next programme for government. It may actually look like a different programme for government. So I think, you know, that's where I would probably point to as a critical juncture that needs more substance. If we don't have room on the island for political parties, certainly, given Donald Webb as a member of political party.
Might disagree.
But, well, it would seem, of course, democracy hasn't been, I think, substantially tested on that issue for some considerable time. But, you know, certainly, I think, talking to a lot of people, including constituents, that wish for sort of one dominating party is not necessarily there on such a small island. Nevertheless, you know, we are in a position, I think, where a lot of people feel and believe that democracy is not delivering for them, and therefore I think we should be acknowledging that and seeking that improvement. So I would say, if you look at the process that's involved, if the House of Keys, for example, put in their trust in one individual to be the Chief Minister based on a manifesto, and yet that manifesto may or may not be the absolute document for the next stage, is potentially something I would say is challenging from a democratic perspective. And therefore, actually, you know, when you put it the way you have, and I've answered the way I have, you then say, well, actually, shouldn't you give that person some more ability to influence and justify, in the right circumstances, under the right caveats, with everything else, some potentially some of the decision making that is taking place.
Okay, last one for me on this. Towards the end of debates, Mr. Thomas has a habit of throwing in interesting remarks, things that have been quoted elsewhere, but are usually Mr. Thomas quoting himself. One of the ones that came up very recently, I think, in the last sitting, he said something along the lines of, it's been said before that the Chief Minister is a prisoner within his own Council of Ministers. He normally does this right at the end of a debate, so you never get a chance to respond, and I just thought I'd give you the opportunity, if you wanted to, feel no obligation to, if you wanted to respond to that kind of assertion, because in the context of the role of the Chief Minister and the role of the Council of Ministers, it feels apt, I suppose, to give you that opportunity, but feel free not to.
That's not a good description of collective responsibility at all. I mean, I think like everybody else, and I've made it clear to everybody, we all make consensus decisions, as you will well know, Mr. Hooper, in terms of things don't always go our way. Absolutely, they're not always perfect, but we have a duty and responsibility when you take on roles as minister for service as well, and part of that service is ensuring that we also conduct ourselves and deliver a stable government. I think that's one of the things the island is renowned for. But like everybody else, if that collective responsibility means I resign, if I have lost faith in that policy or in those policies collectively to deliver the right outcome, and that's purely and utterly my responsibility, and that description is just that could apply to any chief minister at any point. Effectively, we operate collective responsibility. We also operate consensus, and the makeup of that consensus at times, I'm under no illusions, it's tricky, it's difficult, it's not always easy, but it isn't even for a prime minister in charge of a party with a substantial majority. So within a party that has many different collective views. So no, absolutely not. I lead in terms of chairing the Council of Ministers, delivering on those policies, supporting those policies until such a time as I felt they were no longer in line with my views, in which case then I have decisions to make.
Okay. Back to you.
On to Mr. Peters, actually, on the structure of government.
Yeah, structure of government. There's a lot of talk. I mean, for 4.5 years, it seems to be the thing that most people say to me about the growth of government or the size of government. And the size of the civil service. We've spoken about it in the past, and I think you told me then that actually the numbers aren't going up as people perceive them to be. But basic question, is the government too big?
Well, I have tried personally and with the Cabinet Office to try and get clarity, because I think it is important that you look at where the areas of growth have been, rather than just say the whole of government has grown, which it is correct, but predominantly, I've said this many times, the core of growth has been health, education and home affairs. Actually, I think if you analyse that against the whole rest of government, you would find the rest of government had actually shrunk in numbers, and those three areas have provided that substantial growth. I think absolutely a government needs to be on top of its capabilities to deliver within its financial envelope, and in other words, within the finance that has been provided, but more to the point, constantly challenging itself as to the value for money that it is delivering. And I think you have to remember also, you put that alongside a government that is delivering trams, trains, buses, Gaiety theatres, Villa Marinas, all sorts of other items and businesses that perhaps would not necessarily be found in another small government. So, there's been lots of challenge around this. I think we are trying to ensure that we are delivering efficiently as possible. There are opportunities to digitalise. We all recognise that, and we are trying to pursue that programme. The other thing I would just say within a context is that, as a government, we are putting together legislation, we're putting together policy. People are having to write that legislation. We're having to bring all that through. We're having to do our own analysis of finance, of economics. We've got our own regulators. The government has a very wide, necessary mandate in terms of the island, but of course we need to be on top of those services and looking for value for money and in each and every one of them. I think that's the size of government. In terms of the structure, I'd go back to the point that I made before, and I think it is worth continuing to look at how government is structured. I think single legal entity clearly keeps flagging up in all this. That is quite a complex subject in terms of change and what would be needed to undertake to change, and would also potentially drive at some of this necessary separation of powers. And naturally, even within the executive itself, there are parts of the executive that are needed to challenge the other part, the executive by statute. But there is continued questions about how effective it is, particularly from operational effectiveness, running the system under 9 separate departments.
Well, I've answered when people have asked me about the size of government, the fact that it's too big, got far too many pen pushers. I've made the point that we live in a very different world these days, and actually a lot of the roles that didn't exist maybe 10 years ago are now almost mandatory to do the job that we do. But if we had another VAT problem with the UK and they halved our VAT share, we would have to reduce the size of government and the size of the civil service. So would it take that kind of a disaster for us to get on top of this?
Well, you operate to your means, don't you? And so basically that would have to happen. I think what that would mean in terms of then service delivery and what the outcomes would be on people's lives is very difficult to tell at this point. Clearly, you would look to dismantle those areas you think were the least important, or outsource, or privatise, or corporatise, and So, I think that. My experience of this, having gone through SAVE programs, having gone through an efficiency program, is that, yes, there continue to be areas of operations within that government estate, if you like, the overall functions of government, which could be delivered in an alternative way. The political appetite for change has constantly been thwarted, and I go back to 2006, perhaps even earlier, with the first change program that came forward, and the title of that momentarily escapes me, but we saw 2 versions of that. We've seen a SAVE program, and now we're doing things slightly differently in terms of the way we are focusing on digitalization in order to save the money, and I hope mean that will save the jobs as well as doing things like bringing in recruitment control frameworks as well. But we have to keep working at it. But a substantial change in terms of budgets would clearly mean that the government and Tynwald would have no choice, I suspect, but to make substantial changes to service delivery.
Separation of powers. Do you think there's a clear enough separation between the executive and the legislature?
I think on the whole, yes. I think that, I guess one would simplify that in terms of, is Tynwald still capable of scrutinising the legislature and challenging its functions and effectiveness? Then I do think that is there and remains there, and I think actually, particularly when there are calls to arms around crisis situation, Tynwald does its job extremely well.
Okay. Collective responsibility in the Council of Ministers, is it a good thing or is it anti-democratic?
So I think we've covered this a lot. I mean, it works. There's no question that collective responsibility works, and it is one way to do things. I think the question is it the best way? But unless you're willing to try and advance then how the system works by potentially either deciding that you need to perhaps reform its strength in terms of what we've just been talking about and from a leadership perspective, or dilute the way the council does its business. I certainly had a view, actually, when I came in, that I was going to try and have less collective responsibility and try and encourage more debate and give council more free votes. But the truth is that's been really difficult, because actually you've seen that as potentially, well, because perhaps some of the dangers, as Mr. Hooper was highlighting before, he's going to have ministers arguing against ministers. Whilst in some respects that might be quite healthy if you treat them as parliamentarians, the bottom line is it'd just be swung or switched the other way and just saying that government's arguing with itself. So, there is unfortunately, when you look at it and examine it, there has to be some need for some government unity in order to make progress, because I guess if the splits and flaws were publicly put onto the floor, then it is going to be challenging. So, I absolutely would like to try and find ways to improve outcomes within this Council of Ministers framework. Otherwise, I think you look at a completely different setup and you almost change tack again, and you revisit this board view and decide whether actually departments, maybe there's more alignment with, say, a couple of departments, say Treasury and DfE. Should they sit under a board which is made up now of more different political representatives, and does that board then effectively come and convince Tynwald of its position and deliver the budget? So I think you would need to switch away completely from the council ministers and effectively look to go back to almost the sort of Jersey Guernsey now models of these types of boards that would look at finances, the economy, social infrastructure, health, etc. So,
final one from me: is there an issue of democratic legitimacy and accountability within the Council of Ministers?
I don't think so. I think it's I don't think that is a major issue at all, because ultimately, irrespective of whether council has got it right or wrong, and the individual minister is still exposed, if that's the right way, in terms of having to justify the policy decision and account for that in Tynwald and indeed on scrutiny panels. So, and indeed, obviously, on a public basis. So, I don't think that from an accountability perspective or democratic perspective, there is that flaw in terms of individual accountability or representation in terms of specific policy matters.
Is the accountability for ministers every 5 years at the ballot box?
No, I don't think that's true either. I mean, I think you can be held accountable. I think Tynwald will make its views known, and I guess that then the responsibility for that accountability and the outcomes from that, depending on what they are, will either be determined by Tynwald or will be determined by the Chief Minister. So, from that individual perspective, I think that there is that accountability, definitely. Doesn't necessarily, you can drive into the sort of heart of council, if you like. The mechanisms are there to sort of get to where that decision-making process was undertaken. But nevertheless, arguably, should we've ever got to that position in the first place, particularly if the policy that is being sort of taken through and driven through is causing a lot of angst and trouble on the outside in terms of the public view of that.
Thanks.
I've got a few questions off the back of some of the things that you've said. I'll start with the executive and the legislature. In the last administration, with the Emoluments Committee conversations and debates, moving into this administration, have there been any concerns around departmental membership, around the amount of members that might be in a department? Has there been any concern around all of that in this administration, or was that something that was very much limited to the last?
I think there is, I would say there is, for me, a concern. I mean, I think this sort of equalisation of pay has potentially caused Tynwald members to take a different view of the role and working in a department or not working in a department. Some members have chosen not to do that, as we know, and not to take part in government. I think it certainly used to be the case that the majority of members would determine that extra £10,000 uplift, if I remember correctly, for the figure was worth it, and therefore they would go into a department, and the benefits of that obviously were the individual would gain some experience and understanding of government, but would also contribute actively in some way, whatever department they were in, towards the outcomes that were being delivered. And that, of course, also meant they would probably sit on one department, possibly two departments, and at least one scrutiny committee. And I don't feel that traditional piece is there anymore in terms of people's views, and I suspect that's been driven by the fact that it's neither here nor there where what they actually do as members. So this is moving outside that sort of council of ministers piece, but in terms of the current makeup of Tynwald and how that's functioning, I would certainly have a concern, because I certainly don't think we collectively are at our best at the moment in terms of delivering good outcomes in scrutiny or as a collective. And I think that emoluments piece probably did lead to a different approach.
I think that's kind of what I'm trying to get at there, is has it had an effect on the way that a minister, Council of Ministers is functioning, in that additional scrutiny that would sit around each departmental table in sort of bolstering the decisions that are made by individual ministers in manoeuvring forward their own policy as it's been under development, and then goes into the Council of Ministers. Do you think that there has been an effect? Have you seen an effect of that? Is what I'm trying to get at.
To sort of justify anything than a perception that I have. I suppose that has been a negative effect. For me, that effect is more clearly demonstrated, I think, on the floor of Tynwald, where often I perhaps think a lack of understanding or knowledge about how the government has reached its decisions has perhaps fed into the way that then the discourse has taken place. But ultimately, I think the importance, well, it's obviously up to individuals, but there is certainly, in terms of the politics that we run, the consensus that we run, the understanding that, I would hope that all MHKs want to contribute towards delivering positive outcomes rather than just sitting outside of government and scrutinising and opposing, and that's absolutely a valid piece. But I think, in order for us to deliver the best outcomes overall, and I think that's where your question is heading, and I'm not answering it very well, and I apologise for that, but the role of Tynwald members contributing, at least in one small way, to government outcomes, I think has been very important in the past, and should remain an important piece, particularly in terms of their future. If they are standing again and they're successfully elected, then I think their electorate would benefit, particularly if you're looking at that ministerial piece. If an individual comes back in, irrespective of the fact they've been in opposition, they've still done a government role, they can at least understand and see what is going on, so that whether they agree or not, they're still able to speak to their constituency base with some authority about change if they think it is necessary. So I do think it does contribute what is happening there in terms of the effectiveness of the Council of Ministers in terms of outcomes for people, both in the short term but even more importantly in the longer term as well.
And you speak of the longer term there. I mean, obviously there are most members, if not all members of Legislative Council are serving on departments at present, some serving on 2, some serving on 1. Has it been as a direct result, perhaps, do you think, of what you've just described there, of a lack of interest in departmental membership, and then what you may foresee into the future of it becoming an issue, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think clearly and categorically, the need to have legislative council members in greater numbers across government has been regrettable, but necessary, ultimately necessary. But it has, I think, been directly driven, by the discourse, but perhaps also partly contributing to that has been the change in terms of remuneration. I welcome the look at the whole piece, because I think it is really important. But ultimately, you have to think about to get focused on outcomes for people. There's a danger we look internally at ourselves, and that's the risk at the moment with politics and democracy, is that we're sort of focused within the democratic bubble, which we might think is okay, but the truth is, are we delivering enough of the right outcomes for people? I'm not saying it would fundamentally change absolutely everything in terms, this is just one piece of the puzzle, but if you're suggesting, does the committee need to review and take a look at that, I would say yes.
Did you want to ask a question?
Just picking up on that, actually, you mentioned that you think it may have had an impact on members deciding to serve or not. Has any member actually expressed that to you? So obviously there are some members in this Tynwald who aren't in any government departments at all. Have any of them expressed that part of the rationale for them not taking a role was because the pay uplift had gone?
No,
I don't need names.
No, I don't. Well, I'm not suggesting that. No, they haven't said that was the rationale, and I think that I wouldn't say it was the single thing, but I'm simply suggesting it may well have impacted.
I have another question. And I just want to stick with the structure of government for a second before we move on. The Treasury, a number of those that have attended for oral evidence have suggested that there is a strong hand of the Treasury to consider in the Council of Ministers and the part that it plays. What have you experienced that may allude to? Have you experienced anything that might suggest that perhaps Treasury has a stronger hand than perhaps it could do?
I think the hand of Treasury is a very, very strong hand. I think it is probably the strongest hand in government, if I'm honest. I see that more now, perhaps, than when I was in that in that function and in that role. How Treasury interacts and deals with the challenges, not just in the Council of Ministers but across government effectively in terms of budgetary control, where the money is being spent, how it is being spent, remains challenging, I think. I think we have developed this view where Treasury's almost become the guardian of the public purse and will do anything to sort of stop spending taking place, which in one sense is good, because you absolutely need to stand up and challenge as to the value for money. And on the other hand, clearly there is potentially a lot of frustration as to how that interaction works. Perhaps to put a slightly more positive spin on this, or take a positive more look. Actually, this morning, in Operational Performance and Change Board, one of the projects is contracts across government, hundreds of millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of pounds of external contracts, being given, but actually the ability, in this case, of the Treasury to get all the data together and start to go into departments to examine that. So I'm sort of flipping that around slightly, but it's proving actually quite tricky and difficult, even just to get it all unified, and then to start a position of saying, okay, well, we need 10, 15, 20% of savings. So we're talking about a savings figure that could come out of 10 to 20 million pounds, that sort of amount. But it is, so I'm just putting that on the converse, but I think it's a two-way street. And actually, this is where it sort of gets a bit more complex in terms of single legal entity clearly is a significant change, right? And would take years to implement, and we need to get on with things. But how do you improve that piece in terms of, if you're running a big organisation with 9 separate entities, you would want, and the centre, the holding board, if you like, would be then wanting that information, that data, and control over some of the expenditure. So, yes, that I know can be very frustrating, and I know there's lots of issues around the budget setting process. Having said that, there's also understandably this tight grip on finances from Treasury, and understandably you can recognise why that would be so. So yes, it is always quite a position. It can be a position of conflict, but I think that we have got a select committee looking at that budget setting process, and I suspect that would feed into perhaps some of the frustrations that you would generally get from ministers who are under a lot of pressure for whatever reason in terms of frontline delivery and the policies that Tim Ward or the government have agreed that we're going to deliver versus the money that is available at the time.
I'd just like to ask, I suppose, we talked earlier about sort of a veto type approach for the Chief Minister. Effectively, Treasury has that veto already. That's sort of how it works in practice. How would you see those two systems interacting? Do you think that there should be a bit more control that the Council of Ministers or the Chief Minister has over the Treasury in order to, like you've already alluded to, where something is going off track? Actually, at the moment, it feels like if it's the Treasury that's going off track, there's not a lot you can do about it. You're kind of hemmed in, really, by the way the legislation works, by the power that Treasury have. Do you envisage that relationship needing to change, that balance of power needing to shift?
So, again, interestingly enough, one of the non-executive directors at OPCB thinks that role needs to be changed, and that actually almost that Treasury comes under the Chief Minister effectively on a day-to-day basis. There would have to be a junior minister or ministers potentially involved, because there would not be the capabilities to do that and perhaps deal with some of the other issues as well. But that was their view in terms of alignment to make actually the decision-making process in the Council of Ministers more effective, but also more accountable. So it does actually lead into the discussion that we were having before, and is certainly potentially a credible option in terms of saying, well, actually that needs to be merged together. Certainly that relationship is absolutely critical, really. In terms of how it would probably, or how it does operate in the UK and under which we are based. The only difference is, of course, again, you're running that party system in the UK, and over here you're not. So yes, there is definitely an argument, I would say, for more oversight control, because actually that potentially might solve the problem that I was initially talking about between that sort of democratic gap, if you like, when you elect a chief minister on a mandate that they present forward, and versus then the mandate that's actually sort of brought into play once the next stage happens. And I would argue that actually there has been a bit of conflict, as far as I'm concerned, between actually some people who said, well, I elected you on that manifesto, and now I didn't really like what the government came up with in terms of the island plan. So some of that tension could be potentially resolved. And then, in that, I think there's always got to be an accountability piece. So where does that accountability piece happen? If that happens, and you can see that's got clear space, if you like, on the floor of Tynwald. Because going back to that original piece, if you're going to enhance power, then you have to equalise that on the other side as well. But you've also got to ask the question, is this going to deliver better outcomes for the island, whether or not you and I agree with those outcomes, as long as we think and believe and can see that there is actually having a beneficial effect for people, and there is that trust in the democratic process. But I think it's a very good question.
I'm just sitting here enjoying the views of Chief Minister Alfred Cannan saying that the Treasury should come more under the Chief Minister, and thinking, I wonder what the Treasury Minister Alfred Cannan would have said 5 years ago.
Well, listen, I mean, absolutely, poacher turned gamekeeper and all the rest of it. I think there's an absolute recognition of the strength of that role. Mm-hmm. But then I guess the Finance Minister in any jurisdiction is going to carry a lot of significant responsibility.
Yeah. So moving on to the role of the Attorney General, do you think that the relationship between government and the Attorney General works well, and the AGC works well?
In terms of the sort of presence of the Attorney General at the Council of Ministers, the advice that's given to ministers,
the many hats.
From what I can see, it works well. The Attorney General sits in every Council of Ministers formal meeting, is there to offer words of advice. He is there as a reference point for us. That's an absolutely necessary function, and I think on that basis, that relationship works well. There's absolutely a need for the Attorney General's chambers. Clearly, the size and scope and the way the interaction of that advice then is given to departments perhaps is something that probably needs a bit of overview. Certainly we've obviously examined that to some degree in the past few years, in particular the back of the employment case that we've been through, but I'd say certainly that's something that needs to be continually looked at.
The Attorney General is impartial.
Mm-hmm.
And politically impartial. The practice, in practice, has the AG got too much political influence because of the roles that sit between either Tynwald in Legislative Council and then also in the Council of Ministers, or are we happy with the level of influence that sits there?
I have never, in all honesty, felt that the AG has ever interfered or tried to extend unnecessary influence or political influence into council's decision making. From my perspective, I've always thought he, in this case he, or she actually, whenever the current attorney is represented by somebody else, has always, that advice has always been legitimate, straightforward, and focused on the question or the issue at hand. I've never felt there's been an attempt to try and change the political will unnecessarily.
Thank you. Cabinet Office. Mr. Hooper.
Yeah, just to pick up on two small themes that we've touched on already. Mr. Peters asked about the size of government, as to whether or not government as a whole is too big. We've had it asserted to us by previous witnesses that the Cabinet Office very specifically has grown too big, has started to become something of a monster. Do you have any views on that?
Well, it's a bit of a dichotomy, really, because I think that the Cabinet Office has these responsibilities, and we've centralised all this power with HR, with GTS, and taken some of those levels of responsibilities out of departments and given them to Cabinet Office. There are obviously issues that have become, I know it's now passed to Treasury, but immigration, for example, has become much more of a relevant issue and a bigger caseload than perhaps it had ever been in the past. We've obviously got things like Moneyval that are going on at the moment. So there's been quite a, probably asking me that question right now, I can give you a few examples at least where I can see and understand why Cabinet Office has grown. I think you have to also look into context in terms of, has there been shrinkage in some of these other departments? Certainly some of the evidence would point to the fact that once you remove health, Home Affairs and Education, that quite a few of those departments, I think, are operating with less numbers. So arguably there's been some transfer of numbers. But again, I would go back to and ask the question about delivering, effective operational efficiency, and how you want that to happen, and whether you believe, in terms of the steps that we've taken in this government to create a chief executive officer, to try and give them a little bit more power to be accountable to an operations performance and change board about the stats and the data, financial performance, numbers of people employed, efficiencies, and whether that type of reporting and type of accountability should be streamlined into a centre point, or whether you actually believe, no, I just want the departments to operate entirely by themselves and to be effectively accountable on that basis. So, that's fundamentally the question. But the Cabinet Office's role within that then would naturally, so if you, of course, streamlined GTS and said, no, you look after all your IT things and all your OHR, but I think the past history would also say that model has led to a great deal of duplication, a great deal of inefficiency, and there's certainly a drive, much more that we can do from an efficiency basis. Actually, I would be challenging more the roles and functions of, say, things like the PSC, Public Service Commission. Is that actually, in this day and age, needed when we're investing so much into our OHR department in any case, and whether that actually should be resolved within a more streamlined organisation. So there are these types of peripheral organisations.
So we get that assertion quite a bit from government when, during the debate on the Department of Education's plan only last week, it was pointed out that the number of teachers and UCM lecturers in their plan has reduced over the last few years. But actually the number of staff in the centre has gone from 27 to 45 or 25 to 47, I can't remember which, but it's almost doubled. And the assertion that was given by the Minister was, that's just staff being moved around. It's not really an increase, it's just staff being moved around. And actually looking back at the Cabinet Office numbers themselves, 2 or 3 years ago there were 360 staff in the Cabinet Office, 360 FTE. Since then, immigration have left, obviously, moved over to Treasury, but this year's, the most up-to-date numbers are 382.2. So even though you've lost a whole division in immigration has gone somewhere else, the Cabinet Office is still bigger than it was 2 years ago. And I suppose the question is, as part of that efficiency work that you've alluded to, is someone looking at this, rather than just saying, it's definitely more efficient to have these staff centrally? Has anyone done any actual work on that to check that kind of assertion to make sure it stands up?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons for having non-executive directors, we're recruiting for one at the moment, is to try and bring in that high level of expertise in terms of significant corporate experience to try and focus on driving through the policies and the efficiencies and where they're likely to lie, with valuable experience in terms of either sort of multifunctional, multidisciplinary, global type office environments where not everybody necessarily is based in the same office or unit. And I think from my view, again, there's probably no perfect system, but there are definitely going to be better ways of examining that. And it's not always going to, sometimes there's a political will. So, for example, like drive through the efficiencies project, we've had to try and find additional technology staff that and business managers that are capable of getting into. I think we've had about 180 projects put forward across government or something in that region, and we're trying to tackle that. Means, of course, that we need to try and prioritise, but also some of these departments are asking for things to happen quite quickly, can see benefits in, for example, processing and digitalising vehicle licensing. I mean, it's an easy one to pick on. But there is obviously a process that's involved with that, including the business case and then the technical piece of getting the programs written and getting the technology updated. So it is a question of swings and roundabouts. I think what we need to have confidence in is that recruitment controls are in place. People are properly being held accountable in terms of signing off for these additional roles. They're adhering to the business case, and ultimately they are going to lead to demonstrable savings and better outcomes for the public. So, yeah, I'm again, I'm not sure whether the figure you gave did or didn't include the immigration department, but I'm just giving you
just from the 2025 report that was published in June or July this year. So I'm assuming that, because that's after the immigration has moved, I'm assuming that includes the move out of immigration into the Treasury. I may be wrong.
Okay, right.
I've got a couple of questions just on Cabinet Office there. The Beeman's review that was undertaken just before the start of this administration, then leaning into this administration, the changes that were made with the Chief Executive Officer, the Chief Operating Officer, there was a suggestion of another Chief Operating Officer. I think that one was to be the CEO of the Cabinet Office. The other one was envisioned to almost oversee performance of COG or the Chief Officers Group. Was there any review of the changes that had been made, an evaluation of sorts of whether or not it's achieved the outcomes that you expected?
So I think when the previous Chief Executive Officer departed, we did sort of take a look at terms of how things were functioning, because you'll appreciate, of course, that the previous Chief Minister was also Minister of the Cabinet Office as well, and I determined to take a different approach and try and effectively almost create this office of soft power, and to look across government and not to get myself arguably too involved with just one specific department, but to try and have a broader role, and that led to creation of Operations Performance and Change Board. And I think the system has developed. My view is actually that the role of the Operations Performance and Change Board is pretty dull and detailed work, but it is and does have the potential to make some real differences in terms of that coordination piece. So we have got Treasury sitting on that board now. The Chief Financial Officer or his delegated officer will attend that board, which is actually fairly recent in terms of their attendance, but that's adding weight to the financial position. We've got proper analysis and data being fed into that board now in terms of staffing numbers, financial numbers, project deliverables. So, and OHR obviously sit on that, and the Chief Executive Officer is effectively being asked to be held accountable for that board overall. I think that board, should strengthen, but also I think over time, over the next 12 months, 18 months, should start to really deliver some credible evidence of its capabilities to organise efficiencies across government. And I think at that stage, in the next 12 months, I think, the government, Tynwald should take a closer look at that board and its effectiveness, because it does go to this actually coordination in the centre, getting that accountability, getting everybody working together, getting the data fed in, and giving them the authority to drive further change forward or further examination of critical areas, I think should work, rather than retrench and go back to actually, no, I want this all back out in departments. Because I think there is, I can see evidence, and it's hard to explain because it's, a board. A lot of this detail is taking place in, executive rooms, and actually from a public perspective, it's all quite dull and detailed. But it has got the potential to, I firmly believe it's got the potential to deliver results, and particularly if it's driven by individuals from outside government, but who are very skilled, in overseeing this area. In other words, they're bringing that private sector expertise in to challenge the public sector delivery, and there has been quite a lot of challenge, in terms of how things are being approached and where the savings are likely to lie, and what should be looked at and what's not meeting, private sector standards. So, going to that sort of overarching principle, I think there's still merit in this centrepiece, and strengthening that capacity to deliver. I also think it actually does mean that there is accountability, but that accountability's got to, in terms of deliverability, I think it's got to be strengthened. We need to see more from this board, but I think it's probably going to be another 12 months before you're really able to turn around and say, actually, I can see some real progress with what's being delivered here.
Yeah. Okay, and it sort of leans into my next question. I think we've kind of alluded a little bit to subject matter expertise in and around the centre of soft power. How well equipped is Cabinet Office in terms of subject matter expertise in delivering on policy objectives?
I think some good officers in Cabinet Office, and I think it's clearly got, capable of delivery. I mean, it's got to prioritise a very busy, heavy workload, but there's no reason, to doubt that. I mean, I think it's the prioritisation of the work, the policies that are coming through from the Council of Ministers, particularly, and the role of the Cabinet Office in terms of either coordinating that or delivering on its own individual functions. I think I would be, looking at the scope of the work rather than the quality of the people that are delivering it, because I think actually in most cases there's some very skilled and highly motivated staff within Cabinet Office dealing with some quite tricky and difficult issues.
But the NEDs, they've improved that situation.
I think unquestionably. I mean, I'm very pleased with the quality, and we're having to recruit for one at the moment because there's been a conflict of interest in terms of his commercial decisions to join another board, but hugely valuable input, and it should be continued to be encouraged. And I think actually, I'd say in the evidence that I've seen, I would encourage the use of that expertise where relevant in departments particularly.
Thank you.
I believe Mr. Peters.
Single legal entity. This is something that's been coming
That
up
one.
for years, I'm sure. Should the government be moving towards becoming a single legal entity, and what are the pros and cons of that?
Yeah, again, I mean, I think to a degree, we have covered this in terms of my view that the government naturally has statutory roles and requirements across its estate, whereby a different department may take a different view, and I think that even in a single legal entity, you're still going to have those issues that will need to be overcome. I think this is about efficient operation of the departments together, in terms of absolute recognition of what can be delivered and coordinated in such a way to give maximum value for the taxpayer, and a recognition of what areas of either operations or policy, effectively whatever is going on in the centre will remain the remit of that department and will have that process attached to them. So a single legal entity process is going to take years of time to sort out, right, with the changes in legislation and all the other changes that are going to come with it. Again, if I could absolutely see that was going to make significant differences to the residents and citizens of this island, then I would be all for it. Just don't think the energy and time that would be put into that would necessarily deliver the significant change in terms of outcomes. What would be far better doing is enhancing what we have at the moment. That's why I welcome actually this scrutiny committee, because it's focused particularly on that leadership piece, that council of ministers piece, and the other subjects you're talking about. And I would be looking to enhance those as much as possible, because I think there is room for considerable improvement.
Has there been any work that's been undertaken on, not the scope of it, because that's been talked to death, I think, both in government and also in Parliament, but in terms of trying to sort of look at some of the things that sort of sit around the fringes of what may be or could become a single legal entity that might assist government in its work, and assist in sort of creating a more efficient system. Things like, GDPR, say, for example, that type of thing. In tackling problems that.
Yeah, I mean, I think all these types of legislation and procedures like GDPR, for example, have in their own way created a huge work stream, and have meant and have potentially created quite a few problems for government, even in trying to get information from departments that you might otherwise believe to be relevant sort of national information, but has otherwise proved to be difficult. I don't think there's been a full analysis. We certainly haven't sort of taken a proper analysis of all this type of work, like the role of the Information Commissioner, GDPR, and everything else that we've had to adhere to in terms of evaluating improvements and the capability of government to change that to deliver better outcomes. Obviously, recognising that it is a block from a departmental information sharing piece, but again, how do you find the best way around that? And certainly I know, for example, things like university fees and costs and information that is held by Treasury and exchanging information so that actually people can process applications for fees and charges in relation to universities is one area, I think, where potentially solutions can be found, but they do require a pragmatic approach and requiring permissions obviously to be granted in the right way. But yes, you can get round them by working together, and solutions can be found, but it is challenging.
Will there be a push, do you think, in future? Can you foresee a push towards single legal entity, or is it the type of thing that perhaps everybody will talk about but see as maybe too difficult to eat the elephant?
I think this will just I think it's about the political will, isn't it, and about the desire to achieve change and to deliver better outcomes. I think if I was a member of the public, a single legal entity probably would be the last thing on my mind, and the first thing on my mind would be, well, policies are going to be pursued now from a tax perspective. What's this going to mean for my business? What are the economic policies this government's following more broadly? And what else are they going to do to enhance the standard and quality of living and access to services that we rely on the government to provide? So how that is brought together again goes to the heart of this decision-making process. I think that even if you change to single legal entity, one of the first questions would be about how is that going to be governed, and effectively, almost inevitably, you would be talking about some form of election of Chief Minister or First Minister with potentially more enhanced powers. So, I think there are steps that you could take to test the efficacy of a single legal entity and its ability to deliver better outcomes by strengthening, perhaps reviewing the current processes and saying, well, the argument about single legal entity is about streamlined decision making, is about streamlined efficiencies, about almost effectively uniform policies applying across a single government estate rather than a complex 9-department government estate. Therefore, we should be ultimately striving to see to implement the good points from a single legal entity and deliver on those within the limitations that we have currently.
Any further questions? No. Is there anything that we haven't asked about that you would like to put on the record at this point? Anything you'd like to talk to us about before we close?
No, I think just to sort of emphasise, I think taking things in isolation by themselves without considering the whole, and that's about, obviously you've talked about Latimer House and the separations of powers, but also, how accountability and deliverability can be enhanced and changed and altered. I think so that actually there's more trust in our democracy is critical, and the question is it going to deliver better outcomes for people? And right now that I think is the one thing that we all urgently need, and it's not just on this island, by the way, but actually, as I said, there was a recent Ipsos survey which tells you how critical at the moment the trust in democracy to improve lives, is really wavering. And so I think we should be looking to improve and find ways to enhance outcomes, and partly strengthening our decision making in the right way would be part of that.
Well, I'd like to thank the Chief Minister, the Honourable Alf Cannan, MHK, for joining us today. We'll now sit in private.